Sell the cow right there, 17 and a half, 1800. 17 and a half, 1800. Randall, you look at, she's 1800. 1800. 18 and a half. 19 bill. She's 3-year-old. Yeah, brand new baby. Yeah, you done made ear tag and everything. Sell the whole fair, 3,400 half, 34 and a half. Here, $3,400, $3,000, $3,000 and a half, 1 here, 31, 31, 3,100 here, 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half hour, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, 3,200, 3,200, 3,200 here, 3,200, 31 and a half, Albert. Or she's 6 for 3. Sell the cow, 6 for 3. Sell the cow right here, 22 and a half, 3. 22 and a half, 3. You're 23, 3, 2 and a half, 20, 35, 23, 2,300. You're 23, 22 and a half. Throw on these straight. A 2-year-old, what a pair, 3,400 half, 34 and a half here, 34 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, 4 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 4,200, 42 and a half here, 2 and a half, 42 and a half, 42 and a half here, $4,200, $88X, 88X, 88X. Sell the cow right there, 148.9, 148.9 here, 148 on bid, 148.9, 44, 45, 44, 5, 41 here, 41, 34, 5, 34, 5, 36, 7, 7, 7, 38, 38, 38, 38, 137, put on cabinets, put on blade 100, blade 100. 5 to 2 and a heifer baby. 3,500 half, 35 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 600, 600 half, 36 half, 36 half, 36 half, 3,700, 7 and a half, 85, 38 and a half, 8 and a half, 38 and a half, 9, 9, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, $4,000 half, 4,000 and a half, 4,000 bill, Tyler, number 2, Tyler, number 2. 4-year-old, a brand new baby right there, $3,000 half, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 1 buy here, 3,100, 100 buy here, 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 2 to buy, 32, 2 and a half, 3,300, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 4 here, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 to buy, 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 35 and a half. 6 to buy, 36, 3,600 here, 600, 35 and a half. Put on Tyler, number 2, Tyler, number 2. Where's your 5-year-old right there? Now come on, 5-year-old good right here, 32 and a half, 33, 32 and a half, 3 here, 2 and a half, 3, 35, 33, 35 here, 33, 3,300 here, 2 and a half, 3, 35, 3 here, 33, 33 and a half here, 3 and a half here, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5 and a half, 36, 3,600 and a half here, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 7 and a half, 37 and a half, 3,800 and a half here, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, $3,900 bill, put on buyer number 88X, buyer number 88X. There's your 2-year-old steer right there, 27 and a half, 8 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, 3 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 3,600, 6 and a half, 36 and a half, 36 and a half, 7 here, 37, 37 here, 7, 36 and a half, 88X, 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 push your 2-year-old. And you talking about a well of a steer baby right there. You talking about good and kind right here. 3,500 and a half, 35 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, 4 pound 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 and a half. Good about 41 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3, 43 and a half, 43 and a half. Good about 43 and a half, 43 and a half, 43 and a half, 43 and a half, $4,300 bill. Put on 88 straight, 88 straight, 88 straight. Boy, she's short and solid. Got a bag of milk and a good heifer calf. $3,000, 3 pound and a half, 3 pound and a half. One. You're about 31, one about you're about 31, 3,100. You're about 100, about 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 to buy, 2 and a half, 32 and a half. You're about 2 and a half, 32 and a half. You're about 3, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 4 to buy, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 34 and a half. You're about 4 and a half, you're about 34 and a half, $3,400 bill. Put on Tyler number 2. Well, she's 5-year-old and a heifer baby. You talking about a good crossbred mama right there. She is right here. 3 pound and a half. 3 pound and a half. One. You're about 31 and a half. 2 to buy. 2 to buy. You're about 1 and a half. 2 to buy. 2 to here. 32. 3,200. You're about 200. About 200 and a half. 32 and a half. 3. 3 and a half. 33 and a half. 4. 4 and a half. 5. 35. 35. 5 and a half. Here. 6 to buy. 6. Here. About 36. 6. 6. 36 and a half. 36 and a half. Here. 7 to buy. 7 and a half. 37 and a half. 37 and a half. 37 and a half. You're about 37 and a half. 8. 8 here. 8 here. 8 here. 38. 8 and a half. 38 and a half. 9. 9 about 39. 38 and a half. 88 straight. 88 straight. 88 straight. Short and solid right here, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, 3 pound and a half, 1, 1 and a half, 2 to buy, 2 and a half, 3,300, 300, 3,300, 33 and a half, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 3,600, 6 and a half, 37, 7 and a half, 37 and a half, 7 and a half, 37 and a half, $3,700 bill. Put on Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2. She's short and solid, good. 3 pound and a half, put on 3 pound and a half, 1, 1 and a half, 2, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 3, 3 here, 33, 3,300 here. Put on 3 and a half, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 4 and a half, 5, 35 and a half, 35 and a half, 35 and a half here. Put on $3,500 bill. Put on Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2. She's 3-year-old and a good steer right there, and you talking about the good kind right there. 28 and a half, 9, 9 and a half, 3 pound and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6, here, 6 and a half, 3,700, you're about 700, 700, 3,700, you're about 7 and a half, 7 and a half, 7 and a half, 37 and a half, 37 and a half, you're about 7 and a half, you're about 37 and a half, $3,700 bill. Put on 88X, 88X. A 6-year-old and 2 months bred. A steer baby right there. 36 and a half, 7, 36 and a half, 7. Here, about 6 and a half, 7, 7 and a half, 3,800, 800, 8 and a half, 9 about 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, $4,000, $4,000, 4,000 and a half. Here, about half, 4,000 and a half, half, 4,000 and a half, 4,000 and a half. Here, about 4,000 and a half, 4,000 and a half, 4,000 and a half, 4,000 and a half, $4,000 bill. Put on Tyler, number 2. Is she 5-year-old, 2 months bred? What a baby she got right there. 37 and a half, 800, 37 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, here, about 38 and a half, here, about 8, 8 and a half, here, about 38 and a half, 38 and a half, 38 and a half, here, about 8, 8, here, about 8, 8, 9, about 39, not about here, about 39, about 39, 39, 39, 39, 38 and a half. Put on Tyler, number 2. A 4-year-old right there. A 4-year-old right there. Pretty good little kind there. 34 and a half, 5, 34 and a half, 5. Here, about 34 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half. Here, about 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 35 and a half. Here, about 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 35 and a half. Here, about 5 and a half, here, about 35 and a half, $3,500 bill. On P4. Well, she's 7-year-old, 2 months bred. Let's sell the cow right there. 1,800 and a half, 1,800 and a half, 1,900. You're about 1,900 about here. About 1900 and a half, 19 and 2,000 here. About half, 1 and a half, 21 and a half, 21 and a half here. About 21 and a half, 2, 22 half, 22 half, 3, 23 half, 2,300, honeycomb 100. Boy, she's 4-year-old. Good little heifer baby right there. 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half. You're about 3,000 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 3 and a half, 3,400 and a half, 34 and a half, 34 and a half, 5. You're about 35, 35. You're about 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 6, 6, 6 and a half, 36 and a half, 7, 7. About 38 and a half, 9, 9, 9, about 39, 9, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, $4,000, $4,000, you're about 4,000 and 4,000 bill, throw 88X, 88X, 4x4. Well, bad as I'm hate the weenie, boy, I'm gonna wean the KFC, the cow right here now. 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, one, you're about 31, 1 by you're about 31, 1 by you're about 31 by you're about 2,500. 25 and a half, 25 and a half, 6, you're about 6 here, 6 here, 26, 2,600 half, you're about 7, 7 and a half, 27 and a half, 8 and a half, 9, about 29, 2,900, you're about 900, about 2,900, 28 and a half, 9, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, $3,000, you're about $3,000, $3,000, $3,000, $3,000, 29 and a half, put on angles. Well, she's 72, let's sell that pair right there, see if we can sell it. Sell the pair right there, 35 and a half, 600, 35 and a half, 6, you're about 35 and a half, 6 about 6 half, 7 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 about 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, you're about 39 and a half, 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 $3,900 bill, number 2. Well, she's 3-year-old, a bag of milk. And a good little old baby. 27 and a half, 800. 27 and a half, 8 and a half, 9. 9 right here, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, 3 and a half, 1 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 to 5, 32, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 33 and a half, 4. 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5, 5, 35, 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 6, 6 and a half, 36 and a half, 36 and a half. You're about 36 and a half, 36 and a half, $3,600 bill. Put on fade 71. Phase 71. Bushy 2-year-old, got a good baby. 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 1, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 35, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 600 and a half, 700, 3,700 and a half, 800, 8 and a half, 3,900, 9 and a half, you're about 39 and a half, 39 and a half, you're about $4,000, 4,000 and a half, 1 to about 41, 1 and a half, 42, 2 to about 42, you're about 42, 42, 41 and a half, put on 88X. 3-year-old, what does the baby look like? Oh, yeah. 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 33 and a half, 4 here, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6 about 36, 6 and a half, 36 and a half, 36 and a half, 7, 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 39, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 4,000 and a half, 1, 41, 41, 1 and a half, 2, 2 and a half, 43, 3 and a half, 43 and a half, 43 and a half, 4 here, 44, about 4 and a half, 44 and a half, 4 and a half, 5, 45, 45 here, 45, 44 and a half, put on DS55. 5 before, boys, sell the big good cow right there, $3,000 half, 3,000 half, you're about 5 before on the money, 3,000 half, 1, you're about 31, 31, you're about 31, 1 down, you're about 31, 31, you're about here, half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 2, 32, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 3, 33, 33, you're about 35, you're about 33, 32 and a half, put on Anderson, fit him with Anderson. He's on his own today. No more free rides. Well, she's short and solid, got a good little old baby right there. 2,500 half, 25 and a half, here to bum, bum, 5 and a half, here to bum, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, here to bum, 25, 5 and a half, 25, 5 and a half, here to bum, 5 and a half, here to bum, 2,200 half, here to bum, 2 and a half, 22 and a half, here to bum, 2 and a half, here to bum, 2 and a half, here to bum, on the money now, 22 and a half, 23, 2,300, here to bum, 300 and a half, 23 and a half, 45, 24, 2,400, here to bum, 400, 400, 400, 400, 400, 23 and a half. Wiggins. He's 6-year-old right there. He have her baby 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half one here. Bum 31, one about here. Bum 31, bum 31, 27 and a half, 800 here. Bum 800 and a half, 28 and a half, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, 9 and a half, 9 and a half, 29 and a half here. Bum 9 here. Bum 9 here. Bum 29 and a half, 29 and a half, 2,900. Browder. He's 7-year-old right there. Hey, $3,000 half, 3,000 half, you're the bum, out of here, the bum, 3,000 half, out of here, the bum, 3,000 out of bum, 3,000 out of bum, 27 and a half, 8, you're the bum, 7 and a half, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, you're the bum, 8 and a half, you're the bum, 8 and a half, 8 and a half, 8 and a half, you're the bum, 20 and a half, 20 and a half, 20 and a half, $20 bill, put on Pleasant straight. The 2-year-old little pair of babies right there. 2-year-old right here, get them on. 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half one. Here, bum, 21 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 25 and a half, 25 and a half, 6. Here, bum, 6. Got you 2,600. Here, bum, 600, 600, 600, 25 and a half. Albert. She's short and solid, a steer calf, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, here, 28 and a half, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, 29 and a half, here, $3,000 bill, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 there, 31 and a half, 3,100, put on, Pleasant, straight.
So Jimmy's cows are done. We're just waiting on the singles.
He's 6-year-old right there, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half one. Here, 31, one about here, 31, about here, 31, 1 here, 31 here, 27 and a half, 8 here, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, $3,000 bill, $3,000 bill, 3,000 and a half here, 3,000 and 1, 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, $3,100 bill, put on Tyler, number 2. little 5-year-old right there, 22 and a half, 3, 22 and a half, 3, you're the bum, 35, you're the bum, 2 and a half, 3, 35, you're the bum, 23, 2300, you're the bum, all about her, Albert, 2300, 2302, 2300, Roy, you did, 2300, you're the bum, 300, 2300, you're the bum, 300, bum, half, 23 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 to about 24 and a half, 24 and a half, 5, you're the bum, 5 and a half, 25 and a half, 6, 6, 6, 25 and a half, Roy. Hey, 6-year-old right there, 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 3, you're the bum, 35, you're the bum, 3, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 33 and a half, you're the bum, 45, you're the bum, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 36 and a half, 7 and a half, 37, you're the bum, you're the bum, 37, 36 and a half, put on Pleasant straight. She's a 5-year-old. 5-year-old, right here, I get them on 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, you're the bum, 8, you're the bum, 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, 28 and a half, you're the bum, 8 and a half, you're the bum, 8 and a half, Roy, 28 and a half, 28 and a half, you're the bum, 8 and a half, 8 and a half, you're the bum, 8 and a half, 8 and a half, you're the bum, 20 and a half, 20 and a half, 20 and a half, $2,800 bill, put on Jalen, 13X. What you want to do? Sell the cow? Sell the cow right there, 134, 5, you're the bum, 34, live, 34, 5, you're the bum, 31, you're the bum, 31, 130, 32, 30, 33, 4, 34, 4, 45, you're the bum, 34, 34, 133, put on Brown 6. Yeah, but she's raising him, and she got a good bag on her. See if we can keep them together right here. 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, you're the bum, you're the bum, 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, you're the bum, you're the bum, half, you're the bum, 1,800, 18 and a half, 18 and a half, you're the bum, 18 and a half, you're the bum, 18 and 1,900, 1,900, 1,900, you're the bum, 19 quarter, you're the bum, 19 quarter, 19 quarter, $1,900 bill, fill on SLA. She's a 6-year-old. 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, here, the bum, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, one, here, the bum, 3,000 and a half, one, here, the bum, 31, here, the bum, 31, one, here, the bum, 31, 31, here, the bum, 1, here, the bum, 27 and a half, 2,800, 2,800, here, the bum, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, 28 and a half, 9, here, the bum, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, $3,000, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, one, here, the bum, 31, 31, 31, 3,000 and a half, put on Jalen, 13X. See a little cow right there, 91, you're the bum, you're the bum, 91, you're the bum, 81, 71, 71, you're the bum, 1, 2, 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 30, 82, SLX. See a little baby by the head, 700 and a quarter, 700 and a quarter, you're the bum, quarter to buy, you're the bum, 7 and a quarter to buy, you're the bum, 7 and a quarter to buy, 500, 5 and a quarter, 5 and a quarter, you're the bum, 5 and a quarter to buy, you're the bum, 5 and a quarter to buy, 5 and a quarter, half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 600, 600, 600, you're the bum, 600, 600, 5 and a half on snow. Hey, short and solid 5, just wait a big cow right there, 148.9, 148.9, here, 148 over bid, not about 148.9, about here, the bum, 44, 45, 45, here, the bum, 41, here, the bum, 33, 43, 34, 44, 45, 45, 45, 45, 45, 144, put on cabinets 5. Was she 5-year-old right there? Which you want to sell the cow? Sell a little wetback cow? Sell a little wetback cow right there. Set by the head. 17 and a half, 1800. 17 and a half, 1800. You're the bum, 1800 about you. The bum, about you. 17 and a half, 5-year-old. 17 and a half, 1800. 17 and a half, 1800. You're the bum, 1500. 15 quarter. 15 quarter and a half. You're the bum, 15 and a half. 15 and a half. You're the bum, 15 and a half. 1600. 16 and a half. 1700. 17 and a half. 1800. 18 and a half. 18 and a half. 18 and a half. You're the bum, 18 and a half. 18 and a half. $1,800 bill. Put on Tyler. Number 3. Tyler. Number 3. And he ain't walking right now. He's kind of swelled up underneath now. He weighed him right there, $2.05. $2.05. You're the bum, $2.05. You're the bum, $2.05. 135, 140, 140. You're the bum, 40. You're the bum, 40. You're the bum, dollar bill, $5. You're the bum, 10, 10, 110, 20, 20, 130, 130, 130. You're the bum, 30, 40, 40, 140, 140, 40. You're the bum, 140, 140, 140, 130. Put on Blako. Was she 5-year-old? That's the kind everybody looking for, isn't it? See that pair right there. 17 and a half, 1800. 17 and a half, 18 and a half. You're the bum, 18 and a half. 18 and a half. You're the bum, 18 and a half. You're the bum, 5-year-old. 18 and a half, 1900, 19 and a half. $2,000, 2,000, 2,000 and a half. You're the bum, here 121, 1 and a half, 21 and a half, 21 and a half, 1 and a half, 2, 2, 2200. You're the bum, 200 and a half, 22 and a half. Believe it would, 22 and a half, 22 and a half. You're the bum, 2 and a half, 2 and a half, 2200. Put on fade straight. 5-year-old and a brand new baby. Steer baby at that. 5-year-old right here. 27 and a half, 800. 27 and a half, 800. You're the bum, 800 about. You're the bum, 800, 800, 800 about. You're the bum, 800, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, 28 and a half. You're the bum, 8 and a half. You're the bum, 8 and a half, sir. 28 and a half, 9 about 2900. You're the bum, 900, bum, 2900, bum, 2900, 2900, 28 and a half. Put on Ray 5, Ray 5. She's a heifer, pair of heifers, boys. Yeah, it is. See if we try them one time right there. 22 and a half, 3, 22 and a half, 33 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 26 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 about 27, 27, you're the bum, 7 about, you're the bum, 7 and a half, 2,800 down for 8 and a half, 2,900, 900, 29 and a half, 29 and a half, 3 times, you're the bum, 3 times, 3 times, you're the bum, 3 times, 3 times, 3 times, 3 times and a half, 3 times and a half, sir, 3 times and a half, 3 times Albert. She's a 5-year-old. Got a good beef calf by our side. 1,500 and a half, 1,500 and a half. You're the bum, 15 and a half, 16 and a half, 17 and a half, 18 and a half, 18 and a half, 18 and a half. You're the bum, you're the bum, 18 and a half, 18 and a half. You're the bum, 18 and a half, 19 and a half, 2 pounds and a half, 2 pounds and a half. 1, you're the bum, 21, you're the bum, 21, 21, 21, 2 pounds and a half. Put on Tyler, number 3. Well, she's a heifer. Yeah, the steer baby right there, 1,500 and a half, 1,500 and a half. You're the bum, 15 and a half, 1,600, 16 and a half, 17 and a half, 18 and a half, 1,900, 19 and a half, $2,000, 2 pounds and a half, 21 on the bound, 21, 21. You're the bum, 1 here, 21. Got a man out here now, 21, 21. You're the bum, out over here, Roy, 21, 21. You're the bum, you're the bum, 21, 21, 2 pounds and a half. Put on Jeremy straight. Boy, she's 0. Got a baby right here, 1,800 and a half, 1,800 and a half. You're the bum, 18 and a half, 18 and a half. You're the bum, you're the bum, 18 and a half, 1,900, 1,900, 1,900, 1,900. You're the bum, 100, you're the bum, 1,900, 1,900, $1,900 bill. Put on Blake 5, Blake 5, 10, Blake 10. Hey, 2-year-old. Hey, 2-year-old, the steer baby right here. 24 and a half, 5, 24 and a half, 5, here, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, $3,000 half, $3,000 and a half, $3,000 and a half, here, 3,000 and a half, 1 to buy, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 to buy, 32, 200, 3200, 3200, here, 200 to buy, here, 30, 30, 32, 32, 31 and a half, put on Jalen, 13X. 2 rows of steer calf, what a pair, 3,000 half, 3,000 half 1 year, 3,000 half, 3,000 half 1 year, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 2 to buy, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 32 and a half year, 2 and a half here, 3 to buy, 33, Delbert, 33, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 4 to buy here, 34 to buy here, 34, 34, 33 and a half, put on Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2. She's a 2-year-old steer baby, 2,500 and a half, 25 and a half here, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 25 and a half here, 5 and a half here, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 to buy, 26, 2,600 and a half here, 7 and a half, 27 and a half, 27 and a half, 8, 2,800 and a half, 2,900 here, 900 here, 29, 29 and a half here, $3,000 bill, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, $3,000 bill, put on Jalen, 13X. 181 here, 81 about here, 71, 71 there, 1 here, 71, 64, 5, 64, 5, 6, 164, put on brown number 2, brown number 2, brown number 2. Put all our pairs. He's all of them for a while anyway, boy, she 5-year-old, 6 months bred. He right here, 27 and a half, 800, 27 and a half, 800 here, 7 and a half, 800, 7 and a half, 8, 8, 8, 8 here, 8 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, $3,000 bill, 3,000 and a half, 1 and a half, 3,200, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 32 and a half here, 3,200 bill, 5, 2 and a half, 3, gotta be 3, 33 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 34 and a half, 3,400, put on 5X, put on RP, 5X, RP, 5X. Is he 5 to 5 right here, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half 1 here, 31, 1 and a half, 1 and a half here, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 31 and a half here, 1 and a half here, 1 and a half here, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, $3,100 bill, total RT5. 5 to 7 right here, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half 1 here, 1 and a half, 2, 2 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6, 6 and a half, 36 and a half, 36 and a half here, 1 and a half, 36 and a half, $3,600 bill, on RP5. She 5 to 5 right here, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8 here, 5 to 5, 27 and a half, 8 here, 85 here, 2,800, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, 9 and a half, $3,000, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half here, 3,000 and a half, $3,000 bill, total RT 5X. 2 to 7, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half here, 3,000 and a half, 1 about 31, 31 here, 1 about here, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 34, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5 about 35, 35 here, 1 about 35, 35, 34 and a half, put on SNS 10, and put on ARC 10, ARC 10, ARC 10. And 5 and a 5 right here, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half here, 3,000 and a half, good cross straight cow, 3,000 and a half, 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 34, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 34 and a half here, 34 and a half, 34 and a half, 3,400, put on RT 5X. 7 to 7 right here, 2,500 and a half, 25 and a half here, 5 and a half here, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half here, 5 and a half here, 25 and a half, 2 and a half, 3, 22 and a half, 22 and a half, 3 here, 2 and a half, 3, $2,000 half, 2,000 and a half here, 2,000 and a half here, weighted cow outside, 141, 141, 2 here, 142, 31, 43, 44, 45, 45, 47, 47, 47, 47, 48, 48, 147, on SL10. 5 to 6, 31 and a half, 2, 31 and a half, 2, 1 and a half, 2, 1 and a half, 2, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 3 and a half, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 35, 5 and a half, 3,600, 6, 36 and a half, 7 here, 7 and a half, 37 and a half, 37 and a half here, 8, 8, 8, 8, 38, Tyler, 38, 8 and a half, 38 and a half, 3,800, put on Tyler number 3, 2, Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2. 5 to 6, 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 3, you're about 2 and a half, 35, you're about 32 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, you're about 3 and a half, you're about 3, 3 and a half, 3 and a half, you're about 3, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 33 and a half, 4, 34, 34, 33 and a half, little RT 5X, RT 5X. 5 to 7 could be cow today right here now. 5 to 7, 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 9, 39 and a half, you're about $4,000 hat. 4,000 half, you're about $4,000, $4,000 bill, total RT5, RT5. 5 to 7, she good too. 37 and a half, 800, 37 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, you're about 8 and a half, you're about 38 and a half, 9, 39 RT, 39, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, you're about 39 and a half, 9 and a half, 3,900 total RT, 5X. Yeah, 3 to 6, 3-year-old 6 right here, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 9, you're about 9 and a half, 3 times and a half, you're about 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 2, 2 divided 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 6, 3,600, you're about 600, 3,600, you're about 600, 600, 635 and a half, on 10, 10. Sheet 2 to 7, you talking about a good big sucker right there. Now 35 and a half, 600, 35 and a half, 600, about 600, about 7 here, 37, 7 and a half, 38, 8 and a half, 39, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, about 900, about $4,000 bill, 4,000 and a half, 141 and a half, 32 and a half, 43 and a half, 43 and a half, about 43 and a half, $4,300 bill, put on D, put on 5, put on DS5, put on DS5. She 5 to 6 right here, 37 and a half, 8, 37 and a half, 8, you're about 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 38 and a half, 9, 9, about 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 9 and a half, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, you're about 9, you're about 39 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half, $3,900 bill, so long, does not. He 5 before right here, get him on right here, 5 before, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, you're about 8 and a half, you're about 8 and a half, 9, about 9, here, 9 and a half, $3,000 bill, half, 1 and a half, 32 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 4, 4 about 34, 34, you're about 34, 34, 33 and a half, put on Lockalina 4. 5 to 6, what a monster of a cow. 37 and a half, 800, 37 and a half, 800, you're about 800, you're about 800, 37 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 38 and a half, 38 and a half, you're about 8 and a half, you're about 38 and a half, 38 and a half, 3,800, built on RT 5X. The 2-year-old 6 months bred, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, you're about 8 and a half, you're about 8 and a half, 8 and a half, 9 about 29, 29, you're about 9 about, you're about 29, you're about 29 about, you're about 9 about, you're about 29, 28 and a half, buried, 28 and a half, buried. 2 to 7, 27 and a half, 800, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 9 and a half, 3 pound and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 37, 7 and a half, 8 to 5, 38, 3,800, about 800, about 3,800, 3,800, 37 and a half, put on Tyler 2. 5 by 8, 34 and a half, 5, 34 and a half, 5 here. I'm letting y'all bid right here now. 34 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 5 and a half, 35 and a half, 35 and a half here. I'm 5 and a half here. I'm 35 and a half, 35 and a half, $3,500 bill put on CJ5. It's 6 to 7. She got just a little knuckle off her hip, you say, $2,000 half, $2,000 half here, I'm about 2,000 half, 2,000 half here, I'm about had a banger, I'm about 2,000 half, 2,000 half here, I'm about had a banger, I'm about 2,000 half, had a banger, I'm about 2,000 half, I'm about 1,800, 18 and a half, 18 and a half here, I'm about 18 and a half, 1,900, 1,875, 19 a quarter, quarter to buy, 19 quarter here, I'm about quarter to buy here, 19 and a half, 19 and 2 pound, 2 pound, 2 pound. Got a little bit of a hip on 2 pound, 2 pound. 19 and a half. Put on Wiggins, no, TD on that one, TD on that one. Look here, Barry, if she 5'5", she's a good crossbred lady. 3,400 half, 34 and a half. Here, bum, 4 here, bum, 35, 5 and a half, 5 and a half, 6, 6 and a half, 7, 7 and a half, 38, 8 here, 3,800 here, bum, 800, 38, 3,800, 38, 37 and a half. Tone, Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2, Tyler number 2. She's 5'4" right here, 3 pound and a half, 3 pound and a half, 1 here, bum, her, now 3 pound and a half, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 31, 1 and a half, 32, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, 33 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 35, 5, 35, 35 here, 35, 34 and a half, put on RT, 5X. 4 to 6 to 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 3 here, 32 and a half, 35 here, 32 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 3 and a half, 33 and a half. 4, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 here and a half, 3,700, 3,700 here, 700, 3,700, 36 and a half, put on RT, 5X, 5 to 6, what a girl, 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 8 and a half, 9, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 39 and a half here, 39 and a half, 9 and a half here, 39 and a half, 3,900 dollar bill, put on Doug 9. She 5 to 7 right here, get them on, right here, get them on, 3 pound and a half, 3 pound and a half, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 38 and a half, 9, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 4 pound, 4 pound, 4 pound, 4 pound and a half, 41 here, put them on, 1 about here, put them on, 41, 41, 4 pound and a half, 88, fire 88. 85 before right here, 27 and a half, 8 here, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8 here, 25, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 7, 7 and a half, 27 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, 28 and a half here, 9 and a half, 29 and a half, 29 and a half, 29 and a half, $2,900 bill, put on lock and lane number 4. She 2 to 6. I've never seen a 2-year-old quite that big, boy. She good and kind right here. 34 and a half, 5, 34 and a half, 5 here. 34 and a half, 5, 35 here. What about her, Doug? 34 and a half, $3,000 half here. 3 and a half, 1 about 31, 31 here. 31 about 3 and a half on RT, 5X. She 5 to 6 right here, 32 and a half, 3, 32 and a half, 3 here, 33 and a half, 3 and a half here, 33, 3 and a half, 3 and a half here, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 36, 36 and a half, 36 and a half here, 6 and a half, $3,600 bill, put on RP, 5X. A 4-year-old and 8 months bred right there, good big old cow, $3,000 half, just like buying a pair, boy. 3,000 and a half, 1 here, 31, 31 here, 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 2, 2 and a half, 3, 3 and a half, 33 and a half, 34, 34 and a half here, about 5, 35 and a half, 3,600, 36 half, 36 half here, about 6 and a half here, about 36 half, $3,600 bill, put on DS5. Or she 5-year-old, 6 months bred. The 5 to 6 right here. She's got a stitch now. She's 5 to 6, got an old stitch. Tell her right there, 2 pound and a half, 2 pound and a half, here, 2 pound and a half, 2 pound and a half, here, 2 pound and a half, 2 pound and a half, 1,800, 18 and a half, 18 and a half, here, 18 and a half, 1,600 and a half, where, 131, 131, 2, here, 32, 2, 3, 33, 33, 35, 45, 55, 60, 60, 160, 160, 155, put on Jalen, 2X. 3 to 5 right here, 3 pound and a half, 3 pound and a half here, 3 pound and a half here, 3 pound and a half here, 3 pound and a half, 1 31, 1 here, 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 2 to 5, 32 and a half, 2 and a half, 3, 33, 33 here, 35 here, 33 and a half, 3 and a half, 4, 4 and a half, 34 and a half, 3,400, put on RP, 5X. 3 to 7, one a cow. 3 pound and a half, 3 pound and a half, 1, 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 6 and a half, 7, 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 9, 9 and a half, 39, 9 and a half, 39 and a half, 4 pound and a half, 1, 41 and a half, 2, 42 and a half, 43, 3 and a half, 4, 44 and a half, 5 pound and a half, 45, 45, 45, 44 and a half, put on DS 5. 5 to 5, 2,500 and a half, 25 and a half, 6 half, 7, here, 6 and 7 and a half, here, 7 and a half, 7 and a half, 8 to 5, 8 and a half, 28 and a half, 9, 9 and a half, $3,000 half, 3,000 and a half, 1, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 31 and a half, 2, here, 2 and a half, 33, 3 and a half, 3,400 and a half, here, 4 and a half, 5 and a half, 35, 35, 35, 35 and a half, 36, 36, 36, 35 and a half, put them on Tyler, number 2. He's short 3, just weigh the count right there, 141, 141, you're the 41, 41, 41, 35, 35, 37, 49, 49, 51, 51, 53, 53, 55, 55, 57, 57, 59, 59, 59, 59, you're the 59, 157, put on honeymoon 100. 6 by 6. $3,000 half, what a big cow. 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, go catch just right now, 3,000 and a half. 31, 31, you're 31, 3,000 and a half, RT 5X. She's 7 8 right here, bag in a cab now, 7 8 bag in a cab right here, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 1, you're 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 2, 2 by 2 and a half, 3 by 33, 3 and a half, 4 by 34, 3,400, you're 400, 3,400, 3,400, 3,400, 34, 33 and a half, put on KD, put on TD, yeah, TD. Solid 3. 151, 151, you're the bum, you're the bum, about her, honey bun, 51, 41, 41, you're the bum, 41, 41, 34, 5, 6, 7, 8, 38, 39, 39, you're the bum, you're the bum, 39, 39, 39, 138, put on Blake 100, Blake 100. Short 8 right here, 24 and a half, 5, 24 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6, 6 and a half, 7, 7 and a half, 8, 8 and a half, 9, 29 and a half, $3,000, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 bill, Mr. Browder. She's short and solid 3, got a hip off over her now, 131, 131, 2, 32, 2, to the buyer, 130, 30, put on SL11X. He's short and 8, we better hurry home with her now. $3,000 half, 3,000 half, 1, you're about 31, 1 and a half, 31 and a half, 1 and a half, 1 and a half, you're about Mr. 31 and a half, 2 by 32, 3,200 half, you're about 2 and a half, 2 and a half, 32 and a half, you're about 2 and a half, 33, 35, you're about 33, 32 and a half, put on Tyler, number 3. Short solid 6, 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, you're about 7 and a half, 85, you're about 28,800, 800 by, you're about 2,800 by, you're about 2,400 half, 24 and a half, 5, you're about 4 and a half, 5, 4 and a half, 4 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6, 6, 6 and a half, 26 and a half, 26 and a half, you're about 6 and a half, you're about 6 and a half, 26 half, 7, 7 half, 8, 28, you're about 28, 27 and a half, TD. She's 4 with 6 right here. 27 and a half, 8, 27 and a half, 8, you're about 7 and a half, 8, you're about 2,800 by, you're about 800 by, 28,888 by, you're about 2,400 and a half, 24 and a half, 5, 5 and a half, 6 half, 7, 7 and a half, 800, 800 here, 2,800, 28 half, 28 half, 28 half, 9, you're about 29 by, you're about 28 and a half, put on Barry. He's 7 and 4, 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, 1, 1 and a half, you're about 1 and a half, 2 to buy, 2 to buy, you're about 1 and a half, 2 to buy, you're about 21 and a half, 2 to buy, you're about 22, 22 half, 22 half, 3, 23, 23 and a half, you're about 4 to buy, you're about 4 and a half, 5 to buy, 25, 5, 5, 24 and a half, put on RT3. She's 4 for 3. He 4 for 3 right here. 1800 and a half, 18 and 1900, you're about 18 and a half, 1900, 19 and a half, you're about 19 and a half, 19 and a half, 19 and a half, you're about 19 and a half, you're about 19 and a half, 19 and a half, $1900 bill, put on the honey bun 200. Fit them off now, fit them off. He's 5 before right here. 1800 and a half, 1800 and a half, you're about better than buying a wet bag, boys. 1800 and a half, 18 and a half, she's light bread now. 18 and a half, 18 and a half, you're about 18 and a half, you're about 18 and a half, you're about 18 and a half, 1900, 19 and a half, 19 and a half, $2,000, 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, you're about 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, 21, 21 and a half, 21 and a half, you're about 2, 2 and a half, 22 and a half, 2,200, put on Barry. 5 in a light bread again. 2100 half, 21 half, you better another. 21 and a half, 21 and a half, here, 1 and a half, here, $1 half, here, $2,000 half, 2,000 and a half, 2,000 and a half, here, 1,800 and a half, here, 18 and a half, 18 and a half, here, 18 and a half, 18 and a half, 1,500, 15 and a half, 15 and a half, 16 and a half, 1,700, 1,700, 17 and a half, 17 and a half, 17 and a half, here, 1,800, 1,775, 1,800, 18. 1,800, you're about quarter, 18 a quarter, 18 a quarter, 18 a quarter, 1,800. Put on 2X Jalen. She's 7 for 3. 2,000 half, 2,000 half, you're about 2,000 half, 2,000 half, you're about 21, 1 and a half, 21 and a half, 2 and a half, 22 and a half, 3 and a half, 4 to buy, 4 here, 4 and a half, 24 and a half, 5, 25, 25, you're about 25, 24 and a half, put on Pleasant 1. She 5 by 5 right here, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, you're about 3,000 and a half, you're about get a little short here, cow now, 3,000 and a half, 3,000 and a half, you're about 27 and a half, 8, 8 by 28, 2,800, you're about 800 and a half, 28 and a half, 9, 9 by 29, 9 by, you're about 29, 29, 29, 28 and a half, put on R10, 2 by 2. 2,000 half, 2,000 half, you're about 2,000 half, 17 and a half, 1,800, 17